Hello, this is Michael Weidman. This will be my final presentation for Bible 112 Synoptic Gospels. This short video will cover some of the major themes of the class, so let's get started. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are grouped together relative to John because the word synoptic literally means same lens or same view. When compared to John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a similar view of the story of Jesus and a similar structure. We could say as an analogy that they have the same director with maybe different story elements, different plot points, different order of events, but a similar vision as to how to tell the story of Jesus compared to John. John has a totally different idea of how to tell the story, different story elements to include. Even the things that are the same story bits from Matthew, Mark, and Luke are told for a different reason or in a different way. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a lot of the same miracles, teachings, story elements. So some of the things that appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the parable of the sower and the soils, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, the baptism by John, which is told in John, but only in flashback, and the transfiguration, just to name a few, are some of the similar things that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A lot of the times even they'll have almost exactly the same language when they describe a story or describe a teaching. What do we know about these books? Well, we can deduce that they were all written before 70 AD. One of the really strong evidences for that is that none of them mention the destruction of Jerusalem. This is an explicit prophecy by Christ, and none of them mention its fulfillment, which you would expect them to. Another way is that most people, through textual criticism, believe that Mark came first, and we'll talk about that later, but the book of Acts, we can really directly pinpoint some of those historical events, and that being a second part to Luke, the book of Acts definitely comes before the events of 70 AD. The book of Luke comes before that, and the book of Mark comes before that. All of them can be dated pre-70 AD. We are also pretty sure that Matthew, Mark, and Luke definitely did write the Gospels that we have, because early church writers and direct disciples of those authors claim authoritatively that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote those Gospels. This is definitely against what you might call the secret Gospels from something like the History Channel or the Da Vinci Code, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of James. These do not have those early church father authoritative labelings, and they definitely come much later. So those are not included in our New Testament, where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all attested to by the early church. Some major common themes of the Synoptics. Jesus' message being centered on the kingdom of God. Jesus comes inaugurating the good news, the euangelion, that the kingdom of God has come. That is a major theme of the three Gospels, and what the kingdom of God looks like, being portrayed in the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus doing exorcisms, things like that. Parables feature a major portion of the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus describing in little stories what the kingdom of God is like, using earthly pictures to depict a heavenly reality. This features heavily in all three. And miracles feature heavily in all three. Jesus is a mighty wonder worker, and there are exorcisms are a pronounced part of Jesus' miracle working in the Synoptic Gospels. There are no exorcisms recorded in the book of John. So, lastly, we're going to talk about the synoptic problem. If you have three Gospels that are so similar in their language and their structure and in the kinds of stories that they tell, where do some of the differences come from? The major thinking right now in biblical studies on the synoptic problem is that Mark was written first. Mark seems to be a middle way between a lot of the language that Matthew and Luke use, a middle way between a lot of the stories that they use. And Mark, being majority an account of Jesus' actions, gives Matthew and Luke a basis for what Jesus did, and then a supposed second Q document containing primarily a record of Jesus' sayings. Now, Q has never been found. Q is only a hypothesis to get teachings from Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. So that's a very, very quick overview of the Synoptic Gospels. I hope it was helpful.